right, welcome everybody. We've had a fantastic first half of Raising the Bar, and I'm sure the second talk will be just as amazing. For those who are just joining us, welcome. We're very excited to have you here at the Birdcage for Professor Peter O'Connor's talk, Why Do Terrorists Want to Kill Us? Tonight, over 2,000 people, including yourselves, are taking part in this exciting international event series, making education a part of our city's popular culture. Tonight, also, we've got Radio NZ here recording, just FYI. We hope that you enjoy it, and please don't forget to post on social media with the hashtag RTBAKL for your chance to win one of 5 $100 Westfield vouchers. Great. Please help me welcome Professor Peter O'Connor to the stage.
I feel like I should be doing an improv stand-up comedy routine, but, you know, the topic of the night probably doesn't lend itself to that, does it? No, probably not. But nā rangatira, e nā hohoki, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. It's lovely to see family and friends who I sort of asked to come along just in case things went a little belly up. But I was also thinking, you know, that wouldn't university have been so much better if we'd sort of got together, had a pint in our hand, especially if the lecturer had had 2 or 3, it would have flowed a little bit more reasonably, a little bit more interestingly, or you'd had your 2 or 3. My students always say, I'm much better after a couple of drinks, so, you know, which is a bit of a worry seeing my lectures are usually at 9 in the morning. So slancer anyway. Terror. In the middle of the night, when you're asleep, and you have that dream where something terrible is about to happen, and you go to scream, but nothing comes. Something's behind you, and you want to run. You know the dream? Everyone knows this dream. And your feet are glued to the floor and they won't move, right? Terror. That's the night terrors. We know what that means. And there are people who live in this world who want us to feel that. Not in our dreams, but in our real worlds. It's extraordinary, isn't it? That there would be people, for a number of reasons, who would want us to feel that cold sweat on our foreheads, the pounding in our chests, the inability to express the fear that sits inside us, whether you're walking through a mall, boarding a plane, sitting in a pub, sitting on a tube, going wherever you might be in your life, pushing it back, pushing it away from your consciousness. And yet, of course, it sits with us as human beings and as a nation and as a world. You know, I was really nervous about giving this talk tonight for a whole range of reasons. What could possibly go wrong talking in a pub about terrorism? What could possibly go wrong? And if you have the Deputy Vice-Chancellor listening at the same time, what could possibly go wrong? And Radio New Zealand recording with just that soundbite where it's not quite right what he said, was it? And I've worried about that, and it's part of the difficulty of talking about deeply significant and serious things in a democracy. I love this idea of bringing the university into a pub. The idea really is not about bringing the university, but bringing serious ideas and having conversations about important things. Because that's what we should be doing, isn't it? Talking about serious and important things. And there's probably and possibly not much more serious than what's happening in terms of the fear that we have around terrorism. I was nervous doing the Google search. What terms did I put in? And who might be alerted by my search? Oh, you may laugh, but I'm guaranteeing a very thorough check in Los Angeles, next time I go through. But it's real, isn't it? This notion of what it is to be thinking, talking about, having conversations, deep, serious conversations. See, but I could have avoided the whole business of doing a Google search and doing a research project on terrorism. I could have just looked at my family history. And I say that because if you'd walked into this pub about 110 years ago, standing behind the bar, and I'm not sure exactly where that bar was, but I imagined the barman who I'm talking about walked through that very door. It was my great-grandfather, Patrick Morris O'Connor, who came here to start a new life, but a new life because he was on the run. And he was a run, and you might have guessed with a name like O'Connor. He was on the run from Ireland. And he was on the run from Ireland. So the family story goes, but who can trust family stories? But the family story goes, because he was from County Kerry, and my dad always said Kerry men fought for 900 years and never surrendered. He fought in a group called the Moonlighters. Now, the Moonlighters were a group who predated the Irish Republican Army, although some of my uncles and great-uncles fought in the IRA and the Kerry Brigade as well. But he, in terms of the family story, had murdered an English landlord late in the evening. They were called Moonlighters because they rode at night and you could get a better shot in the moonlight of the landlords. And the story in our family was he killed someone important. And so they looked at a globe, and when they looked at a globe there in Kerry, they went, "Where's the furthest part you can get?" I said, that's a terrible Irish accent, wasn't it? "Where's the furthest part you can get in the world from England?" And he washed up here. And when he washed up here, he worked in these pubs and created a great life for all us O'Connors who've come down, and I got, my cousins there, the mighty McHughes, and all those people. So, but was my great-grandfather a terrorist? In our family, of course, he was a hero. If you go to Castle Island in County Kerry, you can see the statues in honour of the Moonlighters, those who fought for freedom, willing to die for freedom, willing to die for a cause, who fought injustice. Was my ancestor, I've wondered, a freedom fighter or a terrorist? Nelson Mandela, convicted, sentenced, jailed for terrorism. Nelson Mandela, one of the great human beings of our lifetimes. Freedom fighter or terrorist? These are the questions, aren't they? Well, some of the questions that I wanted to think about tonight. And I have a set of 4 questions that I wanted to talk about. The first one is, are terrorists evil? How does a terrorist become one? How do you be born into the world and then end up wanting to create that sense of terror across the world? Why do terrorists think it's okay to kill? And this is unusual for an academic. I have a solution to some of this as well. Or some possible solutions. Actually the possible solution if you're an academic is a series of questions. Sorry. So the first question that I wanted to look at is, are terrorists evil? When Israeli Secret Service finally captured the once widely feared Nazi leader in Argentina, Adolf Eichmann, 6 psychologists concluded that despite overseeing the largest genocide in history, the extermination of over 6 million people, Eichmann was perfectly sane, or as they described it, terrifyingly normal. Hannah Arendt coined the term the banality of evil, that evil is banal. And she did that while she covered the 1961 trial of Eichmann. Arendt herself was a German Jew in exile, and she was struggling in the most personal ways to make sense of the Holocaust. She wrote a series of articles for the New Yorker, and in the end it became a book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Arendt tried to tackle a string of questions not necessarily answered by the trial itself. Where does evil come from? If terrorists are evil, where does evil come from? If a man who commits these horrendous crimes, where does that evil come from? And why do people commit evil acts? How are these people different from the rest of us? Or are they? What makes people do evil things? Is evil an innate condition? Or do environments and group pressures combine to condition evil acts like violence? And Arendt wrote, the trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many others were just like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institutions and of our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more terrifying than all the atrocities put together. So perhaps what might be more terrifying is if terrorists aren't just mad and evil, they're just like us, but they do terrible things. And in no way, obviously, am I condoning the repugnant acts of terrorism, but instead of just brushing aside and saying these are evil, bad, mad people, what if instead we consider that they are terrifyingly normal who do terrifyingly bad acts? How does that happen? What conditions lead to that? And what might we do to change that? On November 13th in 2015, Omar Ismail Mustafa detonated. I was a little bit like Jacinda Ardern there, struggling with let's do this and trying to work out the stress. Detonated an explosive belt at the Bataclan Theatre in Paris. And it killed 89 people. Police investigations suggested he was an ordinary person, a married father who had never spent time in jail. One of his neighbours even described him as a really great guy, friendly, open. You know, one of the bombers in the July 7 attacks in London was a kindergarten teacher, a father, a son, a brother, a neighbour, an extraordinarily ordinary human being who did terrible things. So what leads ordinary people to do these terrible acts? Well, in my ancestors' case, if the story is true, my father always said, never let facts get in the way of a good story. A true Irishman through and through. In my ancestors' case, it was a sense and a long sense of deep injustice, a long, long history I've been held in chains. A belief in a cause greater than himself. Is that why he did it? Is that why he rode at nights with those other band of men? Did he fight for the freedom of Ireland, the defence of culture, of language, of all those things which other freedom fighters / terrorists fight and die for? But I've wondered too what might have turned him to join the Moonlighters. If you go to Castle Island, in the tower, which is where my grandfather was from, my great-grandfather was from, you'll see on the centre church in the square spikes, 6 spikes. And that's where in 1798 they beheaded the rebellious few from Tralee, chopped their heads off, carried it back to Castle Island and put them there for everyone to see what would happen if you challenged the overlord. And I wondered, Patrick was born long after that, but he must have heard the stories, mustn't he? As a young man, of that incredible injustice and what that would have meant. And I think to myself, when I think of that, when we talk about the way we do about terrorists and we drive for that punishment and we go to war and we do these things, do we instead recruit, bring on board, as perhaps was the case for Patrick? And of course, if we think of Irish history, 1916, the rebellion was a failure. But what really turned the Irish people to support the revolution was a public execution of the 13 martyrs, and in particular James Connolly, who they had to strap in a chair because he couldn't stand, and they shot him. And that execution acted as a galvanizing force for people to stand and overthrow and challenge, and led eventually to the Republic. So what I'm suggesting is that the way in which these things happen isn't about an innate evilness, but about how people are turned from right and good because of the situations into which they're born. So why do terrorists want to kill us? Because it's plain they do. Although, if you read the media, you would think it was worse now than it was 20 years ago. But in fact, of course, we know that there are less terrorist deaths at the moment than there were in the 1980s, especially in Europe. But it's simple. It's about demonstration of power, speaking to power, challenging power, and showing the power that they have. Is to demonstrate the lengths I'll go to. Kill you and I'll kill myself as well. It's extraordinary, isn't it? And perhaps what's most important is that they want to kill publicly. And that's about the magnifying impact of the media. You know, for my ancestors, without the media, it was about the way in which that was sung and told in stories. But it was the same thing, wasn't it? How did you magnify those acts? One human being drives a van. It's carried around the world. The cause is carried around the world. The belief, the challenge, the sweat on the forehead returns, the beating heart, the desire to scream, but if you screamed, what would you say in response? This is planned, this is deliberate. These are the acts that the world faces. And we've understood that terror is a form of theatre for many years. The reign of terror, which is what is the term used to describe the 15 years after the French Revolution. People invited to public executions where they did their knitting as a form of gross entertainment. But it was also about the state ensuring that power was understood and what would happen to if you didn't. in much the same way that the hanging noose in the southern states, tied to trees, let people know when the Klan came through exactly what it meant to be a black man in the southern states. All these things are performed and then magnified above and beyond. So a question we might ask ourselves, what is the role of the media in the creation and recreation of the terrorist? So how do you become a terrorist? Multiple ways to become a terrorist. And I would suggest you are taught to hate. I worked on the board in Jordan last year with Palestinian teachers. And one of the Palestinian teachers said to me, "Do you know, Peter, the trouble in our part of the world? 4-year-old Palestinians are taught to hate Israelis. And 4-year-old Israelis are taught to hate Palestinians. And they're taught. They're taught in the schools, they're taught in song, they're taught in music and poetry and art, and the way in which they have to walk down and through the streets. Everything teaches them that the correct response in that situation is not to love, but to hate, to fear for your own world, to fear for your own, to fear for your family. And then if there are those who radicalize and shift and take that fear and manipulate it so that you're radicalized and you're willing not only to kill others, but to kill yourself. One of the things which disturbs me most about terror and terrorism is the increasing number of young people who are attracted to dehumanizing and fundamentalizing ideologies. Why are young people so attracted to these kinds of ideologies which deny our humanity? It's a huge question for us as a nation. It happens here. It happens everywhere in the world. How and why? It was a question that was asked in the 1940s. And it was asked by governments who wanted to understand why people were attracted to Nazism, to Stalinism, and the great conflicts of the 1930s and 40s. And in asking that question, where they went was this idea that there were two things which fed a desire for fundamentalism and dehumanizing. One was social inequality. That is a fertile ground for the creation of feelings of injustice and oppression. And that what you needed was progressive politics that closed the gap between rich and poor. And we've seen in the last 30 years, of course, a retreat from that. But in education, there was something else. And this was the idea of progressive education, right back to John Dewey in the beginning of the 1900s. And what Dewey was telling us was that a critically informed population, people who could question answers, not just answer questions, was vital for democracy and was the protection you needed so that young people didn't fall into the trap of believing demagogues, of believing those who would lead them into fundamental beliefs. It was called progressive education. And at the heart of progressive education was creativity and the arts. Because what they understood was that the social imagination, which Tracy talked about in our last lecture, that the ability to imagine ourselves and the world better than it is the beginning of hope. Terrorism is a sign of despair. But hope needs people to be able to imagine. How do you train imagination? It's the arts and creativity. So the huge worry for me in New Zealand is we have rising inequality and we have an education system which strips it of creativity in the arts. It's a threat to democracy. And it's a threat to democracy because the appeal of dehumanizing fundamentalism is overpowering for many, and the results are enormous. And if the arts are important, there's one other thing that the arts do for us, and imagination does for us, and that gives us a sense of what it is to be other than ourselves. The word we use is empathy. You know, walking in someone else's shoes. A few days after the September 11 attacks, find it. Ian McEwan, great novelist, many of you will have read, wrote this in the New York Times. Wrote it on September the 13th, 2001. A San Francisco husband slept through his wife's call from the World Trade Center. The tower was burning around her, and she was speaking on the mobile phone. She left her last message to him on the answering machine. A TV station played it to us while it showed the husband standing there listening. Somehow he was able to bear hearing it again. We heard her tell him through her sobbing that there was no escape for her. The building was on fire. She was calling to say goodbye. There was really only one thing for her to say. Those 3 words that all the terrible art, the worst pop songs and movies, the most seductive lives can somehow never cheapen. I love you. She said it over and over again before the line went dead. And that is what they were all saying down their phones, from the hijacked planes and the burning towers. There is only love, and then oblivion. Love was all they had to set against the hatred of their murderers. Those last words spoken down mobile phones, reported to us by the bereaved, compel us to imagine ourselves into that moment. What would we say? What would we do? Now we know. Waking before dawn, going about our business during the day, we fantasize ourselves into these events. What if it was me? What if it was me with the van heading towards me? What if it was me who was walking down that street? McEwan argues this is the nature of empathy, to think oneself into the minds of others. These are the mechanics of compassion. You are under the bedclothes, unable to sleep, and you are crouching in the brushed steel lavatory at the rear of the plane, whispering a final message to your loved one. There is only that one thing to say, and you say it. I read this to my students every year. If the hijackers had been able to imagine themselves into the thoughts and feelings of the passengers, they would never have been able to proceed. It is hard to be cruel once you permit yourself into the mind of your victim. Imagining what it is like to be someone other than yourself is at the core of humanity. It is the essence of compassion, and it is the beginning of morality. And yet I would argue tonight that we need to empathize with those who commit terror acts, not to sympathise with them, not to agree with them, to morally condemn them, but to understand or begin to understand why it is that 7-year-olds in parts of the world will strap explosives to their bodies and kill others and themselves, and not just dismiss that out of hand as an act of madness or evil. How did this happen? How does this happen to a human being? So that in understanding why ordinary people do terrifying things, we might find ways to act out of love, compassion, and a shared humanity. Thank you very much. So Paul Bushnell is the manager of RNZ, and the way this works so that your dulcet tones may be heard across the nation is that he'll come with the mic, and Paul has this very strict thing: he holds the mic. Don't argue with him about this. We are in an old Irish pub, and you'll never got any idea where that might end up. So if you have a question, here's a rule. Don't preface it with a 15-minute speech. Have you ever been to one of those events and you just about go, oh my God, he's talking more than the guy did at the front? So that's the rule. If you talk for too long, I'll go, thank you. And that'll be on national radio and you'll feel really stinky. Is that the right thing to do, Paul? So, are there any questions, or was it all clear as mud and you all agree?
I was interested in your comment about being Jordan and the Palestinians. My experience has been that the young generation of Israelis don't like what their parents and grandparents are doing. They want to be more empathetic. Do you have a view about that?
I don't know if that's something which spreads across the nation. As a man getting slightly older, good, no one laughed. As a man getting slightly older, your faith and hope has to be in young people, doesn't it? It's always that kind of sense, like, don't do what we did, because we have made the world a bit of a mess. So it's that sense and real genuine belief that it's the young people who will embrace a sense of positivity and possibility and empathy for the world. And it's very difficult to keep positive when you pick up the newspaper or go online, because there's so much that's happening around you. And this was the importance, I think, for educators like, Kant said it first. Optimism is a moral obligation. Hoping, believing in the possibilities of the future is something that we must do as a moral obligation. It's extraordinary, isn't it? And teaching from that perspective, and teaching in a way in schools where children begin to think and feel how others might think and feel, is vital for us as a nation. Vital in places like Palestine and Israel. That was a great first question. Did you see the length of it? Tell him a teacher, can't you? God, it's shocking. You're damn sight easier than my students.
So how can we inspire teachers to truly empathise with their learners?
Oh, damn. Did everyone hear that? And so if you repeat it, that'll give me time to think of the answer. It's an old teacher trick, that one. Did everyone get it?
So how can we then inspire teachers to truly empathise with their learners? being learners themselves, of course.
Oh, well, I think you've kind of answered the question, isn't it? It's about how teachers see themselves in relationship with children. People talk about good and bad teachers. It's actually about good and bad relationships. You know, I'm a really good teacher for some kids, and with others I struggle to make that kind of relationship. I also believe the richer and broader your experience as a human being, the richer and broader your possibilities are as a teacher. So, you know, having a rich, broad life and meeting and mixing. You know, it's the first time I've been in a pub, so, you know, as I said before, so, you know, possibly I should do that more often so I meet more people, you know. My wife's smiling, which is kind of not good. See, it's a performance act. We had all the serious stuff, now we get to laugh a bit to get rid of some of that energy.
Is there any difference in empathy? Is there any difference in empathy, you think, between the terrorist who drives his van into a bunch of people and the American pilot piloting a drone who drops a bomb on a bunch of civilians?
Oh, I wasn't expecting that question. Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't talked about state terrorism. I mean, who's the person on the planet you're most scared of? I didn't mention his name. So, yeah, I mean, absolutely. So there's been some interesting literature around the distinctions and between state terrorism. Certainly, you know, drones which fly over Pakistan and wipe out children's hospitals and so forth. So those are significant issues. A number of people have written about the difference, and the difference is essentially around power. So states who do that get challenged, but others who take those other kinds of roles aren't just challenged, but war is declared against them as well. There's something cleaner, of course, you know, about a drone strike. You don't see it. It's not particularly reported on. It's not magnified by the media. Deaths every day. I mean, do you know when the last drone strike was? I don't. So those kinds of things are also part, I think, of the difference. But you're absolutely right, of course. You know, we haven't gone into the distinction between terrorism by illegal organisations and what one might describe as, you know, state terrorism. But certainly I think everyone in the room is aware of those distinctions.
Peter, thank you very much for your presentation. Very thought-provoking and loved it. But I want to challenge something that you said.
Good.
You said that you implied, at least, that people in the arts are the ones with the imagination. I'm a scientist, and I can tell you, we deal with facts, but you need to have an imagination to be able to do science and to explore new things and discover new things.
Oh, look, yes, as someone who works in arts, you're right, I do privilege the arts. But scientists work with the same premise, don't they? Noticing the world, which is what artists do, and working from there, how do you make it better? And imagining how you make it better. So yes, absolutely. And if I implied that there was, that scientists weren't engaged in the imagination, great scientists are artists, and artists are great scientists, and those who work at the pinnacle of both of those recognise and understand that the boundary between the two are fluid and permeable. Absolutely.
Hi. I was just thinking that if we assume that we don't have sympathy for terrorists, I think that largely we probably do have sympathy for them. And so where does that leave us then, if we already know why they do what they do?
Yeah.
Because we do know why they do what they do. And so we've already got that sympathy back here in New Zealand, perhaps, maybe not so much in other places, but I don't think we're that naive. I wonder what other people think.
Yeah, well, we can have a drink later about, and talk some more. I just pick up the distinction between empathy and sympathy. Because empathy is about understanding, because, understanding quite often at a felt but intellectual reasoning and having an understanding of that. The notion of sympathy means that you agree with. And I'm not, and for me, there's a really important difference. I'd get absolutely slammed in the media tomorrow if University of Auckland, don't want to give them the headline, but the headline, but if the headline read University of Auckland professor sympathetic with terrorists, end of career, and rightly so. But the argument being that we need to empathise, which means that we need to understand the motivation for the political, cultural, social underpinnings of these acts, rather than simply dismissing them, I think is really different.
Do you think we do? Do you think we do at all in this country, perhaps, say? Or is that the lack?
I've done, well, here's the thing for me, I've run workshops around terrorism and so forth in nations across the world. I was doing some work in North America, and someone just really made the comment, which I thought was pretty close, which was, it's easy for you, but where do you live in the world? Right. That's a really important question, isn't it? It's all very well for me here in the birdcage to do this, because I feel reasonably safe. Now, how safe would I feel in a bar in New York? How safe would I feel in Lebanon? How safe would I feel in London? I offered to talk like this in Sydney not long after the lone wolf attack in the cafe, and I was told, no way. Which is interesting, isn't it, in terms of democracy, citizenship, participation, all those kinds of things. So maybe it's easier for us because it's not right here in our face. It's in my family, but it's generations back.
What say you to the idea of us versus them, the idea that those who are different than us in some way, who are born elsewhere or believe in a different God, are dangerous, or the idea that we must defeat the evil of those who are different?
Well, I think that's been the route to great historical calamity, hasn't it? And you hear it in the tripping tongues of our world leaders, that we should either fear or despise difference. And I find that terrifying. And I find it terrifying where it might lead to. I'm a New Zealander, and I look across this room and I revel in the diversity, the wonder of everything that's come and made us who we are, and that rich, wonderful tapestry. And there's an anger in me at times around those who would sow dissension, who would sow and build on those fears, that we should be fearful of those who come. It's a terrible place for a nation to end up. And you see that in countless examples of history, don't you? There's something like 700 million people on this planet without a home. 700 million. Where's our empathy for them? Well, that was a depressing note to end on, wasn't it? How are we going? I thought that was about it, Paul, but I'm starting to think about that second pint now.
Hi. You
Hi.
mentioned that terrorism comes out of inequality, and you mentioned that in New Zealand we have a growing gap of inequality in New Zealand. Do you think that could be a hotbed for some? Is there any predictions of that happening here?
Well, here's an interesting thing. There are fertile grounds, aren't there, for people to feel that the world is unjust. But what's really interesting in terms of where I didn't go into psychological profiling of terrorists, but one of the things that's quite interesting is that the vast majority of those who commit terrorist acts come from what one might consider to be the middle class. So my ancestor, Patrick, wasn't bog poor Irish. You know, they owned a farm of 167 acres. And when I was in Ireland a couple of years ago, it was explained to me like this: when you've got your face down in the mud, scrambling around for rotten potatoes, you don't have time to think about who's oppressing you. You're just worried about getting food into you. So, you know, it's often the educated or the politically motivated, those who can raise their face above the soil and go, there's the enemy. So it's interesting, isn't it, in terms of, you know, those distinctions as well. Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Oh, I think it's off. Oh, I'll go microphone-less. Thank you, Peter. That was very insightful, very powerful talk that you delivered there. So that concludes Raising the Bar for 2017. Keep an ear out for next year, 2018, obviously. And if you're going home tonight, use Zoomy, because they're offering a 20% discount when you use the code RTBAKL. Thank you for coming out, and safe journey home. Thank you very much.
Thank you.